welcome to Catalyzing Coherence. This is Matthew Perkowski. We're here with Brian Hofstein.
Hey.
And Melissa Lafsky.
Hey, how's it going?
Melissa is a writer, a storyteller, and a content strategist. She's here to help put on a crypto storytelling workshop this evening. Melissa, tell us more about what brings you here to this workshop and what storytelling means to you and why it's important to this space of the crypto revolution, so to speak.
Well, the workshop came about because, we had a lot of really interesting conversations about how crypto is not doing the best job of telling its own story to other people in the crypto space, but also to the world at large, to the general public that isn't necessarily sold on the value of cryptocurrency or even the need for cryptocurrency. And doesn't quite understand why blockchain could be useful on a societal level, on a global level. So there's a pretty big knowledge gap. And one of the biggest rules of storytelling is that if you don't tell your own story, someone else is going to tell it for you. So the media, crypto is a huge story internationally, up to $1 trillion of wealth will be created very shortly out of seemingly nothing, out of seemingly air. So this is obviously something that the media is covering at length, but what they're saying is not necessarily in line with a narrative that puts crypto in the best light or puts blockchain in the best light. So my view on storytelling and why it's so important is there's a lot of different services that telling a story can serve. It can educate. One of the best ways to teach somebody something new is to tell them a story about it. And it takes them on this emotional journey. And if it's a good story, it's got a clear beginning, a middle, and end. And it allows someone to put themselves in the position of a character or someone else and to really see new things and learn something new. There's also the sort of bridge building around telling stories because it can create empathy. So if you live in one region and your enemy lives in another region, hearing a story about your enemy that you can relate to is going to do a lot in terms of building bridges with that person because it creates empathy. And then the third is actually paving the road for the future that you want. I mean, one of the funny things, I've lived now in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley, and I was a former journalist back in New York. And in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of sort of nuts and bolts of futurism. Like, okay, here's the actual blueprint for how we are going to build flying cars. In LA, there's a lot of storytelling around futurism, but it tends to swing very dystopian. When people reference, certainly on the West Coast and worldwide, I've found, when people reference technology and the future, the two references they tend to go to are Skynet, the evil corporation from Terminator, and Minority Report, both of which pretty dystopian, like not
ideal features.
Not ideal.
Yeah.
So if you're going to tell a story about something that could happen in the future, you have a pretty big responsibility to paint the picture of what the future is that you want and how this technology is going to get us there. So I believe in crypto. Obviously, it's not a panacea. It's not like crypto is here to suddenly take all of the problems of money and humanity and solve them all. But it could be a tool that really takes us to a new place.
Yeah.
So if we're going to get there, we've got to start telling a story about it that shows the possibility of that future and helps people see for themselves, because humans can't create something they don't know about. Like if you don't know something exists, you don't know to even reach for it. We see this in culture all of the time. It's why Black Panther was such a massive cultural moment, because for the first time, African American kids can go to the movie theater and see an African American superhero. And before, that hadn't necessarily existed. Like who even, if you were a child, did you even know that that was something that you could potentially be or aspire to? Obviously, it's superheroes. Yeah, okay, not necessarily real, but still. If we want to be it, we have to know it exists. So storytelling can accomplish that. And so that's why I think it's important to bring it to the crypto space. Also, because if you don't have a North Star if you don't have like a really positive place that you're going to get to, we as humans tend to kind of default into, well, okay, I'll just make the most money. Like, I'm in it for me, and I'm just gonna like make my money and buy my Lambo, which I had never even heard that phrase before, but I heard of like buy my Lambo is something that gets thrown around a lot in the crypto community. And honestly, I wouldn't say it's the best branding for the crypto community.
Yeah.
But if you're not really living inside of a story that you believe in, it's easy to veer off. It's easy to just start to make choices that don't align with reaching the North Star, reaching that goal. So that's essentially why I took my kind of very eclectic skill set and started working with crypto companies.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really good summary of a large amount of this space and like kind of what this space needs in terms of its nascent inability to craft its own story. And also it's a decentralized space inherently. So it's kind of hard to understand, many times in the past, stories have been told by somebody who's been, at the helm of some organization or some movement. And that's effectively like a center point. And so the story kind of comes from the center point. But there's this interesting question of what it means to try to wrap a narrative around a decentralized movement or where the story comes from, or how do you, with respect to our namesake of this podcast, how might a coherent story emerge in a decentralized space?
Yeah, well, Matthew, you and I have talked at length about this, but in my belief system, and I have plenty of data to back this up, the two biggest issues, the two biggest sources of angst and pain and suffering in a human life are love and money. And not everybody has, the same level of angst about both, but every human being goes through life having some suffering about each one of those topics. And if you look at it from the standpoint of, maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe we don't have to create a society where money is such a cause of suffering for so many people. People who have money suffer over money. People who don't have money suffer over money. Maybe it doesn't have to be this way. And I think you and I have sat around kind of pontificating and over drinks talking about like, yeah, and shouldn't crypto really step in and say, hey, look, let's see if we can change that. Maybe we succeed, maybe we don't, but let's try. And I always come at it from the humanist perspective. I do not code. I am not an engineer. I'm here in Silicon Valley, kind of like the Lorax. I speak for the humans, and everything has a humanism element to me. And I'm like, what good is crypto going to be if it doesn't solve some of these deep human issues around money and value and worth, personal worth, individual worth, community worth, power as a community, to live in a way where you are able to aspire to what you aspire to and reach your goals and put forth the things that you believe in and value and have the means to do that. That's certainly what American individualism is all about. So if money is going to be the thing that keeps millions and if not billions of people from actually realizing that, well, maybe let's see if we can think of another way. And crypto has certainly shown a willingness to be that force that comes in and really upends money. So maybe let's see if we can sort of steer it in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting question is, in my mind still, to some extent, who's doing the steering, right?
Oh, great question.
And I think that really relates to this notion of centralization versus decentralization. Yeah. And, I think, you're talking about the humanist perspective, and I may generally come at things slightly more from like the existentialist perspective.
Yeah, you do.
Like, yeah. You've noticed. Where
it's good. It's
where there's some element of this kind of innate difficulty or innate suffering, perhaps, and money was this tool that we kind of slowly evolved as a species to help us figure out how to coordinate our actions and our values. And perhaps it actually at one point in history allowed for the alleviation of a lot of suffering, a lot of that suffering, a lot of those things that we were having trouble coordinating as pre-civilizational primates, right? Trying to coordinate, trying to figure out, who's going to do which labor, who's going to take care of the community, who's going to go do the farming, who's going to do the hunting. Like, how do we represent value in a community? What behaviors are valuable? What do we value as an individual versus as a community? And so we kind of created these weird tokens, and I think that created a lot of good. But in a way, I think what we've talked about in the past is that the previous needs that gave rise to the creation of money gave rise to this tool, but that tool is no longer sufficient for our modern world, perhaps. Like, perhaps there's a lot of elements of value in our modern world that we feel as valuable, but aren't well represented by our current money.
Totally. I am on board with your existentialist theory. And I mean, we talked about this yesterday. A dollar now is detached from a value. A dollar can be used to buy crack cocaine, or it can be used to buy immunizations for children who are exposed to malaria. Those are two very different value systems, but the dollar has no differentiation. It is equally valuable for both. And so money as a representation of value, we're just handing it to people and saying, like, well, go figure out your values, without really offering any kind of framework around, well, what are your values? And look, there's a lot of ways that we could teach people to really focus more on personal values. The education system could be one, but why not have a value system in our currency where it's like, look, I very much value, like humane treatment of animals who are being raised for slaughter. I want to put my money towards farms that are, using humane practices, towards restaurants that are buying from those farms. So I can go be a responsible consumer and go use my money for that. Or we could have a cryptocurrency that inherently supports that, or with a community behind it. Mm-hmm. So it's a value, and you get to say, oh, this is something I value, and I want to go be part of this currency that also values that, that's aligned with my values. And that's not to say that this entirely eliminates fiat currency, because we talked about, look, human society has become large and complex, and there are many, many different values, and we are not here to judge this value is right and that value is wrong. Mm-hmm. That's just, that's a huge part of, in my mind, the problem that American society has gotten into, where everybody's just standing in judgment of everyone else. Like, oh, you believe in this political, you voted this way? Well, I stand in judgment of you. Oh, you don't believe in this particular policy? You are wrong. I stand in judgment of you. And it's like, well, who are you to judge? And I think the same goes with values. I think we can all agree, let's not be moral relativists. Like, certain things have to be wrong in our society, and we shouldn't have, like, I know there's like hate-based cryptocurrencies and there's drug cartel-based cryptocurrency. I think we all have to draw the moral line somewhere and say, like, yeah, okay, we are not going to hold that up as a valid value, or as a value that we stand behind as a society. But things like gun ownership, look, I have my own political ideas about guns. I have very strong personal ideas about guns. But am I in a position to say, like, if you value gun ownership, you are a bad person, and we should not give you the opportunity to be part of a community that also values that? No. So I do think we need to take into account, a lot of people in Silicon Valley, a lot of people on the coasts, we tend to align with some similar values, but there are other value systems that we can also, that have room in cryptocurrency, and that have room in this space. And I think speaking to values as a concept that is a bit more holistic and more inclusive and less judgmental, like there's good values and bad values, might help us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the value space, as you're pointing to, is something that is very dependent on people's paths through the world. Right?
Absolutely.
It's as much of a reflection of what your path has been through the world as it is about any objective state of reality.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of why we have dialogue. That's why we have words and language to kind of figure out, okay, we're both sitting here. We think we're looking at the same thing, but are we really looking at the same thing? Like, is the cup on the table the same cup that I'm seeing? Like, okay, so how would we figure that out? Well, we have these words, and in the same way that we have words to actually negotiate the shared space of our reality, in the greater marketplace, like in these more complex systems, we have, instead of words, we have currencies, right? And not just currency in terms of fiat currency, but also we have things like social currency, right? And these types of currencies are ways of collectively negotiating our reality and value space, right? And
Yes.
so, and therefore, in the same way, I mean, I kind of often look at it in the way where it's like, the same way you don't necessarily want to be stifling people's ability to speak, because people need to speak to figure out what the heck is going on around them, to figure out what's actually even in their heads, really. We need to be able to have people encode their values in these types of tokens, right? They need to be able to, like, if we can tokenize values, then you can actually see this very rich and robust tapestry of values in the world. And you can see that a person is not just one political statement. They're this rich set of values, some of which align with yours and some of which don't, which is like the exact opposite of, for example, like treating someone like a horrible person because you've seen one tweet, right?
Absolutely.
Which is like the exact opposite, which is like you only see one little facet of their entire being.
Absolutely.
And you jump to conclusion about the whole inner entity of that person or their whole previous path to that point, which seems not only psychologically destructive, but potentially destructive of this whole democratic experiment.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, so the social media sort of experiment has been pretty fascinating. I got into journalism right at kind of the dawn of digital media. It was when personal blogs were still this very sort of titillating, cool thing. It was pre-YouTube, pre-Twitter. Facebook was still just for college students. The Huffington Post had just gotten big and sort of emerged as the alternative, or to Drudge Report. And this space immediately started polarizing. Like, well, there's these people and those people, and which one are you part of? And I think we can all agree that that's pretty destructive. People are complex. We are all multifaceted beings, and we deserve more credit than that. And I've seen some lives destroyed from one tweet that someone just threw out as she was getting on a plane to go on vacation, or I've had my own share of writing something on the internet that was taken the wrong way and getting attacked by right-wing pundits. So it's not exactly a representation of who people are. But I do want to go back, sort of to bring it back to crypto. We also kind of point to social media. Social media shows us what's popular. It shows us, in a sense, what people value on a very popular level. Because when you look at Instagram, just taking into account a recent example, Kylie Jenner is on the cover of Forbes and the women's billionaire list. And there are plenty of people who would point to that as like sign of the apocalypse. But I actually think it's pretty fantastic. There's a woman who's barely 21.
Kylie's killing it.
Yeah, barely
She's
21-year-old
slaying.
woman, self-made billionaire. I say props to that.
Yeah, for sure.
But talking about currency, that is a direct example where social currency led to the creation of $1 billion fortune.
Mm-hmm.
This woman built up over 100 million followers on Instagram. I don't know how many she has on Twitter, but I'm sure it's a lot. And then from Instagram, from her popularity, launched a makeup line that is now worth almost $1 billion. So that's a representation. Am I saying the Kardashians should have their own cryptocurrency? Yeah, why not?
Well, I think this is perhaps a rich vein to explore, and maybe I'll put on my devil's advocate hat in question form.
Feel free. Fight me on the Kardashians.
It's not a fight. It's interesting space, right? Because I think one thing that we pointed to earlier is this notion of money being this very abstract representation of value that doesn't specifically break down the actual specific behaviors or the specific values that the accumulation of the money represents. So I would be interested to hear your take on, in theory, what, if you were to break down the value space of the money that Kylie Jenner has accumulated, what do you think that value space looks like in society?
Well, look, I'm not here to make huge sweeping statements about the values of everybody who follows a Kardashian or follows Kylie Jenner on Instagram or has bought a product from Kylie Jenner.
I'm just curious what you think the values might be that she espouses.
She espouses, first of all, she puts a very high premium on personal beauty. Mm-hmm. And women, men, people in this country, we put a value on that. Making yourself into the highest version of yourself, whether that be physically, emotionally. I mean, yes, she did so through some external help, plastic surgery. Again, who are we to judge?
I'm not making judgments. I'm just curious.
I'm not suggesting you're making judgments.
Of like, it's interesting to me from the perspective of like, if there were many different types of money that represented different values, like maybe there would be something like an aesthetic coin where people were like,
maybe so,
like beauty coin.
I think a beauty coin is a really good idea.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about that is like what you'd see is different conversion rates, right? So beauty coin probably wouldn't get a very good conversion rate with, I don't know, for example, grit coin or something like that. I don't know, right? Or
probably not so much.
Or like beard coin. I mean, I don't know.
Probably
right?
not so much.
Maybe it would for male beauty, or I don't know. I'm not really sure. But like, I'm just giving examples on the fly here. But that's the only perspective I'm trying to ask this from, which is like, it's interesting to think about this perspective of looking at these different values as this emergent marketplace of, different values interacting with each other and actually being able to perhaps track that for the first time in human history.
Absolutely. I think that would be fascinating. And doing so without judgment, I think, is so important. Again, there's a lot of, from certainly among like New York media, but there's a lot of sort of camps that would look at the popularity of the Kardashians or their fortunes and poo-poo it and put it down. But I come at it from the standpoint of these are women who are working very hard within a society that is not necessarily set up for women to become self-made billionaires and having enormous success by giving people what they want and by touching upon something that is really important to an enormous number of people. And I think that's an example where social currency has sort of revealed a value that our society holds. So why shouldn't crypto then say, oh, okay, well, there's a value. Like, let's see if there's a way, like you said, a beauty coin, if there's a way to support that value. And also maybe give that value a North Star so that people aren't necessarily chasing physical beauty at the expense of their bodies. Like there's a lot of, people who will do things to their bodies that become harmful. And also...
Whereas like you could see a synergy between beauty coin and health coin.
Exactly. Mental health coin too, the sense that, you can go have plastic surgery or use all the beauty products in the world, but obviously your own sense of self-worth, your own sense of inner beauty and personal value are going to be so much bigger for your external beauty and your own happiness than having the latest makeup or having breast augmentation or any of the rest of it. So guiding people in a healthy direction around beauty, not saying like, oh, it's a bad thing, but having that North Star, having a community around it, having a coin. I see all of this as potential positives.
Is the mainstream culture too toxic to try to undertake such new forms of self-governance? Because that is interesting to think about this very vain aspect of beauty where there is like spiritual beauty, there is natural beauty that doesn't require makeup or other things. As we start to think about new forms of coming together to be a collective body, it's interesting to just try to weave through the dynamics that are already in existence and the ways in which they're not propagating the values that are actually we know to be true and right and good. And again, who's to say what is the ultimate truth? But,
right.
But like
I mean, what's
certainly,
true and right
but
and
certainly
good?
there are aspects of our society right now that are just toxic.
Yes. There's true and right and good are dangerous words because we talked about like the Rashomon effect.
But to some extent, they're
Everyone's
also
Yeah.
also necessary words if we're creating North Stars.
if we're
Right.
creating
Where it's
North
like-
Stars, and I think you touched upon a great point, which is like, yeah, decentralization can solve the problem of one ring to rule them all, like Facebook owning everyone's data and Uber owning everyone's data. Like, there's no centralized body, but there's still someone somewhere that is setting that North Star and putting it into code or putting it into the governance system. Now, I think that we should talk about governance because I think that's a really interesting aspect of that cryptocurrencies are starting to adopt. The idea of governance being, well, a democracy, particularly the U.S. democracy, is based on a system of checks and balances, and the community over time is going to evolve. The needs of the community are going to evolve. We learn and we grow as human beings. We learn and we grow as communities. So a cryptocurrency or a community around a particular value is going to have changing needs as well. And so can you put a governance system in place that kind of gives power back to the people and allows them to, the North Star might move, the North Star might shift. So yeah, I think there's still going to be someone setting the North Star today, but building in structures that allow it to move. I still believe in, the power of the commons rather than just the tragedy of the commons. I think that could really work. Certainly our consciousness has raised enormously. I mean, just going back to the beauty example, I remember in the 80s what my mother used to do to be beautiful. My mother was a single mom and she had 2 small kids and she was dating. And it was terrifying. Like all of the horrible things that women in the 80s
Jane Fonda workouts.
were just, the Jane Fonda thing was fine. Like I would do the Jane Fonda workouts with her. But I mean like the like very barbaric things I won't go into that women used to do for beauty, that a lot of which have now been proven to be very unhealthy and certainly weren't necessarily good for these women's souls or self-esteem or any of it. And I think we've moved away from that a lot. The beauty industry is moving much more towards natural and organic ingredients and natural beauty and wellness. And those are concepts that really didn't exist 10, 15 years ago in the mass sort of consciousness. But now they're really being embedded. Like beauty is not just a matter of getting plastic surgery and putting on a lot of makeup. It's really sort of this cultivation of the self and the best self. So the North Star has moved there. And so we would want the community to be able to move with it.
Yeah. Going back to Kylie real quick.
One
of the things that's really cool about her is that she's a self-empowered entrepreneur. I mean, she's certainly had some help in this.
Yeah, sure. We're not saying she started from nothing.
But in terms of like hashtag the future is female and thinking about new values in the culture and definitely it's in that direction of like, women can rock it too.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
And it's sort of the crypto space in terms of trying to craft a story. It's a story that is open to crafting.
Yes.
That women could take on crypto and be like, this is our currency. If you want to interact with women, you have to use our currency.
Yes.
Anyone is in a position in which they can view this tool as a tool that they themselves can be using. So I wonder, like, as we're doing this workshop tonight, we're trying to figure out ways in which we can tell a new story that empowers people. How does that happen? How does this emerge from our current position? Because we're in this co-working space. There's companies here that are working on these types of problems. But how do we catalyze this coherence in a global way, in a national way? Like, do you see where in your work, how do you see that unfolding?
Well, I think it's time for the crypto community to build a little more bridges with like the pop culture community, the entertainment community, with other storytellers and leaders and entrepreneurs who aren't necessarily deeply embedded in crypto, because it's not, we can talk about these big global problems, but if it's just us talking, in a very small sort of Silicon Valley, San Francisco based community, it runs into the same problem of, oh, hey, let's build a global social network, but hey, we're all going to be here in our little compound in Menlo Park and never actually go to the places that are using our social network and see the ramifications of what that social network is creating. There need to be some bridges built, and I think the conversation needs to be opened up and more collaboration needs to happen. Obviously, it's still very early days. I mean, crypto is in its very early stages still. Maybe we're not there yet, but again, I'm a believer in let's start the conversation now. Let's start thinking bigger about, like, if crypto really does want to come in and be a disruptor, beyond the kind of libertarian ideas of like, we want no government, which again, I'm not here to judge that viewpoint. It's not a viewpoint that I personally believe is going to work for the majority of people who live in governments, who live in democratic societies, who live in countries that have ruling governments. I don't think just make the world libertarian through crypto is going to work. So I think opening up the conversation is important. Do I have the map that's like, well, first we go here and then we go there and then, oh, look, North Star, the world is all more utopian and nobody goes hungry and then there's no welfare state and everyone can sell their own data and yay, utopia. I don't have it yet, but I believe in the energetic principle that you don't always have to know every step. You just have to kind of take the next step. And once you're there, things kind of become clearer and you see the next step beyond that.
So speaking of, we've kind of touched on a few things that are interesting to perhaps bring together. And, you just mentioned this idea of not having the map. We've also been talking with respect to metaphors that have a lot to do with traveling. For example, North Stars are used for navigation, especially on journeys, right? They've been used for seafaring. They've been used traveling over land, everywhere, basically. We have these stars we can follow because there are these fixed points of value. And then before that, we were talking about this idea of communities knowing what their North Star is and then like where their, like what their reality is relative to their ideal or to their goal. And I think it's, the picture that I'm kind of seeing emerge is this picture in which this whole ecology of different types of value systems are finally able to perhaps start self-navigating and also subscribe to their own ideals, and not only subscribe to them, but also perhaps see them actually visualized for the first time, right? We can create technologies that are like maps, like value maps, and you can see these interactions of these different value sets, these different communities, and perhaps how they help each other, and also how they might hinder one another or how they might conflict, which I think is quite important when we're talking about these other ideas of, for example, empowerment in particular spaces where we obviously want to empower as many people as possible without triggering the deep human psychology of like tribal competition, right? Or like tribal destruction or like pathological rivalrous behavior, right? Where it's like, I want to be empowered and I'm going to do so by disempowering you, as opposed to the positive sum variant of that, which is how do we find cooperative modes of interaction, whether it's across the gender gap, across the racial gaps, across economic gaps, whatever gaps might exist or need to be bridged, as you mentioned. How do we do so without also triggering these parts of our psychology that immediately frame the other as enemy?
Yeah, well, we talked about that yesterday, about the two types of power. And when some people talk about power, they mean power over other people. And when other people talk about power, they mean power over themselves, like feeling powerful when you wake up in the morning. And you and I were talking about it, and we were like, yeah, men want power over others. Women want power in their own skin. Obviously, huge generalization. Not all men want that. Not all women want that. But we were sort of talking about it in terms of the traditional masculine view of power versus the traditional feminine. When women talk about power, we want to feel powerful. We don't necessarily want to have 1,000 people doing our bidding at every moment and the power to fire people at whim. And we don't necessarily want that kind of power. We want to feel. empowered. We want to feel powerful. We want to feel like society supports us, and the structures and systems of society are set up to give us that support in reaching our goals, and not tear us down, and not, not do all of the things that men have been doing and making news from doing recently as the Me Too movement progresses. But again, huge generalization, not saying all men want this and all women want that. I mean, look, you get at a great point, which is, as human beings, we kind of need to step it up. We need to evolve a little bit, period. Like, we need to up our level of emotional intelligence and social consciousness. My personal belief system is that the only way society is going to move forward is if we stop relying so much on intellectual intelligence and really start to value emotional intelligence. It is the last frontier of human knowledge. We have no idea what empathy even is. Empathy wasn't even a word until relatively recently. It was not defined in the dictionary. It still does not have a clear differentiation from the word sympathy. We have such a low understanding of it. There's scientific research around it. Nobody knows what empathy is. Nobody knows where it lives in the body. We know that not just humans have it. Other animals show signs of empathetic behavior. Emotional intelligence, understanding what our emotions are, understanding the relationship that they have to our health, the relationship that they have to other people, to the choices that we make, to the value systems that we have, the actions that we take. We need to step it up, period, in that entire realm of knowledge, because it is just so not yet understood, and it's so powerful. That's kind of my soapbox. That's my line in the sand. But yeah, I think that if we're really going to reduce suffering on the planet, if we're going to reduce suffering around money, if we're going to see fewer people falling beneath society's radar and, worrying about where their next meal is going to come from, starvation, people living on the street, as this entire civilization, as a species, we need to up our collective emotional intelligence. But that's kind of a side issue, but it relates. It relates to crypto.
Yeah, no, that especially it relates to values, and it relates to, if we are going to figure out a way of, because so maybe this is the way to look at this. Like evolutionarily, right? Like when we think about emotions and where emotions came from, those obviously transcend humans. Like they're far older than us. Emotional inner realities. Anyone who's had a pet understands that there are emotional inner realities to other animals, and also especially with other higher primates. Like when I was doing my research with capuchin monkeys back in college, looking in their eyes, that there's like this deep shared consciousness, at least the seed of that deep shared consciousness between yourself and this thing that is not human, but still obviously very similar in some ways. That is, you can see there's a rich emotional life in there. And why is that significant? I think it's kind of significant because of the fact that we evolved in smaller scale interactions, right? We evolved in these smaller groups, and emotions seem to be highly effective at navigating those spaces of like smaller groups of values. And then it seems to some extent to me that we hit a limit and started creating language to start filling the gaps of just feeling. But then you create a separation between the internal and the external, right? You create this separation where like you feel one thing, but you can say another. You also get the advent of lying, for example, right? Like as soon as you have language, you can you can lie far more easily than without language, right? So we create these different spaces. And we also see this in the brain as well, where like language is like a very cortical phenomenon, like in the new brain. And like emotions, while they interact between the new and the old brain, like they're much deeper in ourselves. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is perhaps creating an external value space with something like crypto in this world of digital interconnected communication at the speed of light that is entirely scalable might allow us to create some sort of like collective meta brain that actually interacts far more with our older emotional brain, right? Whereas like that language-based brain, that's the very rational brain, would be in between the two, as opposed to like dominating the conversation as it kind of does now in our culture and in our own interaction.
Love it, Matthew. Get on that. No, I think that's fascinating. I think that's an amazing idea. The only thing I would say is that there's no reason why language has to only be in the rational brain. Like, why can't we make it just more okay to have very emotion-based language? And we can even make up some new words. There are other languages that have many more words for love. There are like 10 different kinds of love in many other languages. We have one word for it in the English language. And there's so many emotions. You know, poets write about this all the time, philosophers, writers. There's so many emotions that there's not even a word for. Mm-hmm. You feel it and you don't even have a word for it. Yeah. So maybe it's time to actually expand language a little bit to be more focused on giving us a way to express emotions and then also teach people how to express emotions. I know you guys both, I know your bios, and I know you had very fancy educations. You are like top educated people. I also had a very fancy education. And at no point in my very fancy education was I ever taught how to express emotion in a way that yielded greater understanding and sort of emotional release for me and for the other party. Mm-hmm. That was something that I had to learn entirely on my own. And I learned it. I mean, you could argue, my first marriage was a pretty like fertile breeding ground for learning that lesson. But we're not giving people a lot of tools here in American society. I mean, don't get me started on the state of our education system in general. For the average American, we are all blessed. We had amazing educations. But even for us, like emotional intelligence and how to really use language to express emotion was not something that was ever discussed as being valuable or important or necessary in our educations. So I hear you. The only thing I would say is that language doesn't have to be so rational. Mm-hmm. It can be a tool of emotion.
That was definitely, if that's what I was implying, that's not what I was getting at. I was just getting at the fact that language, when we look at like where it came from, it kind of came from a place of trying to deal with like a shared outside space. Yeah. Like the world of like things.
But it's also, language creates reality. Like it's about the internal reality. Totally. Nothing arguably would exist without language.
Yes.
It just wouldn't.
So in the beginning was the word.
Oh boy, here we go. And then comes the Bible.
Yeah. But all I'm getting at is that like one can imagine that if you're just starting with trying to create like a shared system of communication between two human beings with their own perspectives, starting with things that both can actually, for example, see. Might be an easier place to bootstrap a language from than like the invisible internal states. Yeah. Right? Yeah. That might be harder to initially express in language. Yeah. And so all I'm saying is that I think we've kind of taken a path where we started with language a little bit more in that objective domain. And now we're still trying to figure out how to really map words onto this far more complex domain of the invisible, of the internal emotional. Of the psychological. And it's hard, it's fuzzy. Like it resists not only language, but it also resists quite a bit of scientific exploration. We're still nowhere near where we could or potentially should be with that exploration of emotion. But like you're saying, I totally agree where it's like, it was very rare that I actually had conversations with anyone who was a mentor growing up to help me like figure out or navigate like what the hell was going on inside my own mind.
Yeah. Right? Or your body.
Or how I was feeling or any of that. And who knows how receptive I would have been or not, but it probably would have been useful to have some amount of ability to more effectively articulate and navigate that without necessarily having to feel as much pain as I felt to eventually learn it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pain is a powerful catalyst. It's just, do we really, really have to like put people in that much pain? Can't we kind of like catalyze a little more smoothly?
Yeah. There is actually some new research on emotions. A scientist, Lisa Feldman Barrett, wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made that is terrific. I'd recommend it to anyone interested in these ideas.
Absolutely.
And she actually touches on the nature of words and their role in our experience of the world, and touches on this idea as well that you mentioned of like there are more words in other languages to describe things, and that actually enables new experiences because you're able to even articulate it.
Exactly.
But I'm trying to connect this actually with Yuval Harari's work. And in Sapiens, one of the key takeaways from that book is this idea that more than just shared language, we have shared stories. And that it's through these stories that enable widespread collaboration, cooperation for larger ideals that have essentially turned our species into the species that dominates the planet. And now it seems, and he's doing this work now in terms of like thinking about the future and trying to understand the stories that are, well, he's not doing this work per se. He's basically just describing the state of the world in which the stories as they currently exist and the inertia, the direction that they could be heading us towards. Matthew also wrote a really good story on Medium that's describing this around the need to take back the reins of our data and own our data, because if we don't own our data, we are essentially enslaved by those who do.
Yes.
And so new words, new stories, it seems like the world needs these things now more than ever before. And the decentralized crypto world is coming around at a time that it could actually solve these things.
Well, I love that point, and I want to make a point about owning your own data. Now, from a very oversimplified, when I'm explaining this to people who are in no way involved in the crypto world, I go, look, one of the things I like most in life is to get paid for things that I would do anyway, that don't feel like work. And owning your own data, it is time for every individual, this is my belief, it is time for every individual in society who is doing anything to create value, including just posting pictures on a social network or putting something on the internet. So that's a form of data. To get paid for that data, if that data has value. It goes back to value and being compensated for that value. Every human being should have access to the benefits if they are taking an action, even if they don't consider it work, even if it's not in our sort of system of, well, I go to work and I punch a card and that's what I get paid for. Well, no. If you are doing something in your normal life that has value, you should get compensated for it. And we've opened that up. The internet has opened that up a lot. Like, you knit, oh great, you can create a store on Etsy and people who value your knitting can buy that. Well, okay, it's still centralized. Etsy's still controlling it and taking a cut. Oh, you have a car, you like to drive? You can drive for Uber, earn money. Well, okay, again, centralized. But data is like that final frontier. People are creating data on a daily basis, and that data has value. If it has value, they should get paid for it. They should get a cut. And I'm also a little bit of a, like, screw the man. If you get, let's say, fired from your job, you should have access to other forms of income simply for the fact, for any value add that you are putting into society. And people should not live in terror of being fired from a job or being laid off or not getting a bonus or severance. Or if you work for minimum wage, that should not be your only access to income ever. If you are creating something in society that has value, you should get paid for it. And I firmly believe this, even if it doesn't seem like work, even if it's something that you would do anyway. And I think we need to turn people onto this and really create a social movement around it. And that's the way it's going to happen.
I mean, that's pretty much exactly, that's right at the heart of the piece that Brian mentioned that I wrote.
Yes, which I read.
Yeah. Data slavery and decentralized emancipation.
It was super smart. All the Adam Smith stuff, and it was super smart.
Oh no, that's a different. That was a different one. Sorry, that was the distributed valorism one. That was
yes.
That was more the economics one. This was literally just about this problem of this notion that fundamentally in a world where everyone's gathering our data, you can kind of look at it as the wake. If we are ships moving through this sea of the internet or the digital space, we leave behind us this wake, this pattern of ourselves left behind. And what we don't see is all the little bots that scatter along behind us and scoop up our wake. And what do they do with the wake?
Monetize it.
Well, yeah, but the really interesting thing about, where does this lead? And every sign that I can see is leading to taking all of that data and effectively trying to create virtual representations of who we are behaviorally.
Yeah.
So our virtual avatars.
Yes.
That are, instead of poking and prodding us with test tubes and whatnot, that can happen to our virtual self, right? And so you could think about every company building a virtual model of you, like your most intimate behavior. So in the article, I mentioned like that interesting Target example where Target sent marketing materials for pregnancy related items to a woman before she even knew she was pregnant, based on her purchasing behaviors that were indicating she was pregnant to them, right? And so it doesn't start necessarily as explicitly having these models of us that are run to manipulate us, but that's definitely where it's going. And the only safety, or the only way we can resist that really in the long term, is having a fundamental ground shift in which we begin to look at these virtual clones of ourselves, because that's really what they are, as an extension of our legal person with rights. And therefore, if that's the case, those extensions of our person would have also a seat at the table, the negotiating table, like you're saying. You use my data, well, you can have micropayments, right? So you could have 1,000 companies out there, in theory, paying micropayments to you. But then you have this issue of like, well, no one really wants to manage all of that, right? Like, but we're also at this cool point where we're getting, machine learning and AI at the place where you might be able to have a bot that manages your data based on your preferences, right? And can actually manage your economic footprint of your virtual self. It's like, it seems like that's where things should be going, right? But we need to inform people, and we need to get a groundswell, and people really need to understand that if you don't own your data, it is very much like enslavement.
Well, I think the way to solve that is have someone tell a story about how they made money that way.
Yeah.
Like, hey,
yeah.
here's how I transitioned from, look, I think it's pretty clear that millennials know this, Gen Z knows this. The traditional path of making money in society, like you go out, you get your education, and you get your degree or whatever you're going to get, and you go and you get a job, and then the job takes care of you, and then maybe you get another job, and you go through life having a job, working for someone else, and getting paid what that job will pay you, and then maybe they lay you off or fire you, or they get sold or whatever happens, and then you go get another job, and all of your money comes from this job. And entrepreneurs like to say job as an acronym, just over broke. And that's great. But not every person is an entrepreneur. And I think that's okay. But if we give people some tools where they don't have to go be entrepreneurs, they can just go be themselves. And we have a few people actually start really making money that way, and then evangelize and tell their stories online, have blogs, whatever, go on podcasts like this one. That's how we get people to realize, oh, hold on, hang on here. Like, I do the exact same things that person does. All I have to do is X, Y, and Z, and I get money.
Yeah.
That is a pretty big motivator.
Yeah. While keeping it aligned with values.
Exactly. Without having to do anything that's not in line with my values and my current behavior.
Because we're kind of seeing that emerge, like in, I think maybe like the Instagram, like the hell's the name for that? Like like basically influencer culture, right? So in the influencer culture, we're kind of starting to see this emergence of people surviving economically based on the projection of images of their life and their story into the public domain. But that being said, because it's not really hooked up to any values other than just get as many likes as possible, you see like really strange things emerge from that space, right? Where like you see people that can, I don't know, you see some really amazing things emerge, but you see some really strange things emerge as well.
Like what?
I don't know, like not to be too overly weird about it, but like you have people who are, I guess, for example, making a living off of effectively an Instagram of pictures of their butt, right?
Look, not to go back into the values conversation, but if I've learned one thing about people, they tend to value butts. Like,
yeah, no, totally, and I get it. And there's things to value about butts, right? But like from the perspective of like a diversified value portfolio, right? You don't necessarily want to reduce yourself to just one asset,
unless you are Sir Mix-a-Lot, in which case we will make an exception for you. I don't know. I'm not here to pass judgment and say, but Instagram accounts are somehow the downfall of society.
That's not what we're saying.
I know that's not what
right?
you're saying.
I'm getting at something different, which is the fact that like when you have these very low resolution spaces where people respond to the incentives on like Instagram,
Yeah.
for example,
Yeah.
as opposed to having a
As
better
a-
map
right.
of like a way to understand how to navigate a way of getting money that might also be more commensurate or in line with the best life that
Yeah,
they
the
want
North
to
Star,
live,
the
right?
North Star.
But what they really want, like in their heart of hearts, if they looked inside and said, this is where I want to be in my own personal life in 5
Right.
years.
Right.
And what kind of ways of making money are coincident with that?
Well, I think that's a great question, maybe for another day.
Sure,
Right now,
sure,
I'm like,
sure.
look, let's just get everyone in this country in touch with this potential way of making money. Let's get all
Yeah.
the welfare mothers in touch with the fact that, hey, they have cell phones
Yeah.
and they are posting things on the internet and they have a digital footprint. And as you say, they have this avatar. Let's get them paid.
Yeah.
I think it's way better than UBI generally. If we can do that.
Well, it's way better than Silicon Valley companies collecting all of the ad
for
revenue
sure.
for their data.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, it creates a more symbiotic world, right? Where it's like,
and then let's worry about people posting pictures of their butts. Like we can get to that.
well, I mean, it's articulating. The thing is, like,
I'm just teasing you.
I'm happy to take that further in terms of the general case that actually gets at, because I think that they're quite intertwined, right? Because like, let's say that you have these single mothers at home, right? And there's always this trade-off between, if you are going to go make money online, are you going to make money online in a way that is like in line with the values of like yourself 5 years or 10 years from now? Or in
Right.
terms of like, is the path incrementally increasing in value? Or is it the type of thing where you're likely to get a lot of short-term value and then it falls off and you're left empty-handed again, right? So it's like, all I'm saying is that I think there are these ways of, by opening up this space of values and actually representing them in an open format. I'm not saying like passing judgment or whatnot,
No,
but like
no.
letting people navigate that much richer space of values or marketplace. Then they can make better decisions about what a more sustainable path might be for their life.
Yeah, I think that takes us into a whole nother realm, though, which
Yeah.
is like, why do women choose to be in internet porn? Because it's a really lucrative opportunity for a
Yeah.
lot of women.
Well, again, it's this short-term versus long-term.
They're short term, there's
right.
long term, but again, who are we to say like those women will regret their porn career 10 years from now? So
Well, we don't have
it's
to
a
say
big
it.
conversation. That's
Yeah.
a big, and that goes into the incentives
Yeah.
of like women, men are willing to pay for a certain thing.
Yeah.
Women are able to provide that thing. Is
It's
it
like
right or
we don't want to
wrong?
speak in
Like,
generalities, right? But like for the porn thing is also interesting because
well,
it's like,
crypto does well with porn.
well, yeah, but I mean it's also interesting, right? Because it's not like all people with all psychological profiles are going to regret it, right?
No.
It's based on who you are and like where you think you're going,
Absolutely.
and what your needs are, what your tolerances are for certain types of attention, for example. But then we have this thing where it's like we do know that some people with some personalities and some psychological profiles don't respond well, and they say it themselves, right?
Yes, they
So
do.
like all I'm saying is like having a forum where all of that information can be open and like people can understand like whether they're more like X or Y, and maybe that would be a good decision for me, or maybe I should look in a different area because there are now 10 other options available to
Yeah,
me.
if we make other options
Yeah.
available and
Yeah,
give women
yeah.
a choice,
Yeah.
then they're actually able to make a choice.
Yeah.
But my response to that is to bring it back around to my earlier point. Let's raise everybody's emotional intelligence and self-awareness, and then they'll actually be in a place to
Yeah. No, that's an integral part
their
of it.
economic opportunities.
Sure.
And then they're in it back to power. They are in an empowered position to make a choice. Oh, well, yeah, I can go post pictures of my butt online, and that feels good to me. And that feels like, I love my butt. I want to share it with the world. And it will make me money. Awesome.
Sure.
Or they can say, you know what, that really does not feel like it's in line with my values. It doesn't feel good to me. And I have these other options, so I'm not going to do it. But right now we don't have parity, we don't have level playing field, and we don't necessarily have a society that focuses on sort of these kinds of intuitive, high EQ conversations with oneself when
Sure.
it comes to decision making. And we have a society where it's like you got to make money because there's no social safety net. So go make money however you can, especially if you're a woman. And the incentives are pretty messed up. So I think if we can work holistically on multiple things instead of just making crypto the sort of answer to all this, I think it will help.
Yeah. I think there's about 10 other conversations wrapped
There's
up in
like
that.
50 we could
that we could
We've got
probably should
Kylie
have
Jenner,
in the future.
but the porn industry EQ, Adam Smith,
These sound like hot episodes. These will pop off. Everybody will love those.
Well, I mean,
Catalyzing Coherence, the porn episode.
yeah. Hold on. I don't want to be like, oh yeah, it was the episode with the girl was the porn episode.
No, not at all.
I'm teasing you guys, but anyways, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you guys. We could talk for like 5 more hours.
Yeah, it's been amazing. We really appreciated you coming by. I know I had fun.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
And we look forward to having you back sometime in the future. And I guess we'll get back to people with how everything goes this evening with our storytelling workshop.
Yes. We'll have to get everybody's opinion about Kardashian coin and Kylie Jenner.
Yeah.
The important things. Anyways, yeah. So much fun. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Cheers.
Goodbye, everybody. Hello, fellow travelers. I'd just like to take a second to thank you for joining us. The mission of Catalyzing Coherence truly centers around building a community that's passionate about a more coherent future for humanity, and we'd love for you to get involved. If this content resonated with you, we invite you to help us build our community in a way that works best for you. First, please like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on future content. We also have a Facebook group, and you can find us on Twitter at @CatCoherence. Our primary community building tool is Patreon, where you can find us at patreon.com/catcoherence. We'll be posting exclusive content there, so if you're feeling especially generous and would like to help us keep the lights on as we pursue our mission to bring you high-quality content concerning humanity's future, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We look forward to seeing you there. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.